Good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Scott Ritter. Scott's name needs no introduction because Scott has been doing a lot of interviews on the subject of disarmament, Russia-Ukraine war, NATO, European relations with United States, foreign policy of United States. And I would like Scott to introduce himself in a proper way with all his designations. But the other part of Scott's life that a lot of times goes undetected is that he is a renowned author. He wrote a number of books. I am a proud owner of several of his books, and I'm looking to read some more. And I would like Scott Ritter right now to take the stage and introduce all of his proper titles and designations so we all could learn about what Scott's career was like and what did he do in life that brought him to this level of the expert on U.S. foreign relations, United States weapons and disarmament and treaties and UN subjects. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Scott Ritter. Scott, hello.
Well, hello, Lena. Thank you very much for inviting me to your podcast. I'm honored to be here. How to go about introducing myself. The first thing I'd like to point out is my name's Scott. My formal name is William Scott Ritter Jr., but my parents opted not to call me Billy or Junior to differentiate me from my father. So I was Scott. I've been Scott my entire life, and that's the best way to refer to me as. I'm simple Scott. I'm just a regular guy who grew up. I had the opportunity to grow up all around the world. My parents were military professionals, so I went to high school in Hawaii, Turkey, and I graduated from an American high school in Germany. I enlisted in the Army out of high school. I think being a child of a professional military officer during the Cold War, I was imbued with a sense of patriotic duty. So I felt that it was my obligation to serve my country. I enlisted in the Army. It was the post-Vietnam Army, and it did not go well with me. Let's just say that. I was not happy with the Army, the lack of discipline, the level of racism, and the lack of dedication to the service. I was a little bit more fanatical than, say, the United States Army in 1979 was. So I left the Army, went to college, and began the process of becoming a Marine Corps officer, attending officer candidate school every summer while I studied Russian language, Russian history, because I made it my goal. It was the Cold War. The Soviet Union was the enemy. So I made it my goal to know my enemy. I wanted nothing more than to have the opportunity to close with and destroy the Soviet enemy through firepower maneuver, go to war with them. That's a little bloodthirsty today, but that's what I was all about in college. I played football, I drank beer, and I prepared my mind to kill Russians. And then I joined the Marine Corps, and I was made an intelligence officer. I was assigned to a field artillery unit where we practiced to perfect the art of delivering high explosive rounds into a Soviet enemy. And we were pretty good at it. We were ready. If the opportunity had come, we would have acquitted ourselves well. Fortunately, and at the time I thought it was unfortunately, but fortunately, wiser minds prevailed. Ronald Reagan, then the President of the United States, sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev in December of 1987 and signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, a treaty to get rid of an entire category of nuclear weapons that had put both the United States and the Soviet Union on the edge of the abyss, so to speak, nuclear conflict. The Marine Corps is tasked with providing a certain number of Russian linguists and experts in Russia to this new inspection agency, the on-site inspection agency. I see you're smiling because you read my book and you know what I'm about to say. I was the exact opposite of an expert. I barely spoke Russian. Like I said, I played football and I drank beer, which means whatever Russian language I was doing wasn't stinking in. And I knew the history pretty well, but I wasn't. I was a very junior officer, very inexperienced, and I was put in the crowd of giants, literal giants, men who were legends in their respective fields. And I write about it in the book. People like Colonel Connell, George Connell, like Ted
Yes.
England, like Roland LaJoy. I could just go on and on and on.
Yes.
These are living legends, people who accomplished so much in the field of intelligence during the Cold War. And here I come in knowing nothing. And the next thing I know, I'm in the Soviet Union. And I've always joked, people are like, well, how did you become an expert in disarmament? And I have to tell you, it's simply by being the first person to do it. You see, when no one else has ever done something and you are literally the first person to do it, you become, by definition, by default, the expert because you're the only one who did it. I was the first person on the ground in the Soviet Union to become an inspector. Everything I did was the first time it had ever been done. It doesn't mean that I was really clever, I was really good. It just meant I had a unique set of experience. And then I was able to capitalize on it. And fortunately, because I was surrounded by some extraordinary people, my peers and my superiors, the things I did tended to succeed. And I got a certain reputation coming out of this wonderful experience of implementing the INF treaty. I got high level attention. The director of the CIA, the commandant of the Marine Corps, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I was recognized again as a very junior officer. I'm getting this recognition, and it was. I mean, it was somewhat humbling to be put in that position because, believe me, at the end of the day, when I woke up, I looked in the mirror and I knew the truth. I knew who Scott Ritter was. I knew I wasn't this superstar. I knew I was a guy with a lot of concerns, a lot of doubts, a lot of fears, a lot of, just the kind of things that the average human being has. That's all I am. I'm just simple Scott. I'm not anything extraordinary. But I had this amazing opportunity, this amazing experience that then propelled me on to my next job, which was supposed to be with the Marine Corps. I went to a school, but then the war came. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and suddenly I found myself in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, working on the staff of General Norman Schwarzkopf as an intelligence officer. But because of my experience in the Soviet Union as a missile inspector, I had the reputation of being the missile guy. I'm not the missile guy. You know this. You read the book. I'm not the missile guy. But they called me the missile guy. And one day, General Cal Waller, who's the deputy commander with 4 stars on his shoulder, comes into the room and he goes, "Where's the missile guy?" I'm like, everybody's looking at me. And I'm like, that's me. And I got taken out. And I became the Scud expert. I'm not an expert on Scuds. When I was in Vodkinsk, they produced Scuds in Vodkinsk. I didn't know it at the time, to show you how stupid I was back then. I just knew about SS-20s, SS-25s, but now the Scud was produced. And everyone's like, he was in Vodkinsk. He knows missiles. He knows everything. I know nothing. But now I'm put in charge of trying to come up with ways to kill these Scuds. And long story short, I had what they call a good war. You know what a good war is? That's where you live and you don't screw up. I had a good war, and I came out of the war with a good reputation. I did some interesting things and made my reputation of being a rock solid analyst. And then the war ended, and it was time for me to get out of the Marine Corps. Remember how eager I was to kill Russians out of college? Well, now I had served my country in war, but we were no longer at the Cold War. Russia was no longer the enemy. And the only reason I wanted to join the military was to kill Russians, because it was during the Cold War, they were the enemy. They're not the enemy anymore. I've already served my country in war. And I was like, maybe there's something better I can do in life. Plus, I had fallen in love. There was a young lady I met in Vodkinsk where I served. She was a linguist there on the Russian side. We didn't fall in love there. Trust me, that didn't happen. But during the, when the war ended, it was time for me to get out of the Marine Corps. We reconnected, and so that was going to be my future. I was going to get out of the Marines. I was going to marry this wonderful lady and start a family and move on. And we tried to do that. We got married. But in August 1991, while I'd been given a job offer to go over to the Soviet Union with H.J. Heinz. You might recognize that name. They make ketchup, but they also do food processing. Because, as you saw in my book, I was part of a team that built something out of nothing in the Soviet Union. The H.J. Heinz was going to build a food processing plant in southern Russia, and they wanted me to head up that opportunity. to be the plant manager. And so I was supposed to go over there, and then they had the coup in August of 1991. And H.J. Heinz pulled out of the Soviet Union, and I was unemployed. And then I got a phone call from a colonel, Doug England. I write about him in the book, the guy who fired me. You remember early on, who didn't like me. We turned out to become very good friends. And he had been assigned to the United Nations at the end of the war, tasked with overseeing the creation of an inspection team that would go into Iraq to disarm Iraq. And it turned out the Iraqis were lying. And he said, we need an intelligence capability. And he said, I happen to know an intelligence officer who helped write the book on on-site inspection, who actually fought in the war, and he knows all about Iraqi Scuds. Why don't we bring him in, and he can help create this intelligence capability? So in September of 1991, I was brought to the United Nations, where I stayed for 7 years. And over the course of 7 years, I became one of the senior chief inspectors operating in Iraq. I participated in over 45 inspections, 14 of them as chief inspector, many of them controversial, all of them critical. At least 5 of the inspections that I led ended up with Security Council resolutions being passed about the potential for military conflict against Iraq. So the work I did resonated at the highest levels. Let's bring this down to reality. I'm still just Scott Ritter. All of this is happening. And I mean, I have to tell you, on occasion, I would be put on an airplane and flown to a foreign capital. I would get off the airplane and a limousine would come up and a colonel in full uniform would come and open the door and bring me in like I'm some sort of very important person. And then they drive me to a meeting, defense ministry or foreign ministry, and I'm meeting ambassadors and secretaries and generals, and they're all talking to me as if I am the smartest man on the planet. And I'm sitting there going, holy cow, I am literally at this stage 32 years old. And these guys are treating me like I'm some sort of genius, and I'm not. I mean, I was good at what I did, I'm not going to lie, but it was all very humbling. It was one of the most unique experiences of my life. But in the end of the day, in 1998, it became clear that the U.S. government was promoting a policy that I couldn't support. My job was to disarm Iraq. The U.S. government was promoting regime change policy, using my team for purposes that they weren't designed to be used by the Security Council. So I resigned. And from 1998 until today, I've been speaking out critically of American foreign policy, not because I hate my country, just the opposite. I love my country more than anything. I would die for my country.
Exactly.
I've already believed that. But I think it's the duty and responsibility of every American citizen to hold their elected representatives accountable for what is done in their name. And if we are enacting policies abroad that are inconsistent with the values that we claim to espouse as a nation, then we must speak out. And so I've been speaking out ever since. And that's what brings me to your podcast today.
Yes, thank you. And I have been speaking out too. I mean, in a smaller capacity, of course, not on the world stage or in Iraq, but yes, I've been speaking about the Ukraine situation since who knows when. From whenever it was even possible to post something on the internet. I commend you, Scott, for your courage. You seem to have a very humble approach to your magnanimous persona and how famous you are now, and obviously you take it very, very humbly, which is very commendable. But I would like to say to you is that a lot of people look up to you because we as Americans, media has been lying to us. Media has been complicit in perpetuating a lot of the politicians' narratives. And people are looking for someone with courage and with honest approach who could, like yourself, explain to us what is our foreign policy like? Why are we running around the world changing regimes? How close are we to the nuclear war if this doesn't end? Is this really a danger, or are we just imagining things? I mean, people are looking for answers, and unfortunately, neither our politicians or our media provide those answers. So I applaud you for doing that and taking the time of your day, and you're busy writing, because you could be writing books right now, but you're actually meeting with people like myself who try to bring the message to the wider audience, and you meet with others at the various events. I've seen and followed how you meet with people and do the question answer sessions. It's very important what you do, and please do not underestimate yourself. But the question about foreign policy, one of the questions I have is, remember, Scott, is a very confusing subject, and that United States always refers to as a rules-based international order. What is it? Why does Russia seems to have a complaint against this rule-based international order? Because it's not a law, because it's something that America just institutes and changes that will. What is rules international order, and why does Russia say that they no longer wish to have the world be based on rules-based order? What is it, Scott? Can you enlighten us on that?
Sure. Look, during the Second World War, the five victorious powers, the United States, France was sort of brought in at the end, but the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and again, China was sort of brought in at the end as well, agreed that this kind of conflict could never happen again. I mean, let's just look at it from the Soviet perspective. 27 million dead, an entire half of their country devastated. From the European perspective, again, an entire continent just ravaged by war. The American perspective, while our homeland didn't suffer as much, we still lost a lot of people, and it was a full effort on the United States on two fronts, a Pacific War and a European war. And it exhausted the nation. Even though we didn't suffer the human cost that the Soviets suffered, the nation was exhausted by it. And there was a recognition that this could not happen again. But now, how do we go about making sure it doesn't happen again? And the concept of a United Nations was created. The idea that the victorious powers would come together and bring the international community together as a United Nations, sort of a follow-on from the League of Nations that was created after the last World War I. But the League of Nations failed. It had no teeth. It had no ability to enforce. And so the victorious powers decided they would create something called the Security Council. They would be permanent members with vetoes, but they would work together with the world to impose a rule of law. And that's what we're talking about, the rule of law per the Charter of the United Nations. But now the United States is looking at this, and the United States is in a little bit of a quandary at the end of the Second World War. You see, prior to the war, we had been in a Great Depression. Our economy was in the tanks. It was the war that enabled us to come out of this depression, the war that enabled us to go into a war production footing, get our heavy industry reinvigorated, to bring the American economy alive. And we were positioned after the war to be the dominant global economy, to control the world. Now, there's nothing in the United Nations Charter that talks about this. The United Nations Charter doesn't talk about the relationship between the dollar and the pound, the dollar and any other currency. But we do. We imposed it on the world. Well, actually, that's not fair. We had a system that, because of the war, was imposed on the world. And now for us to direct the world in the way we wanted, we needed to sustain this system. And it is this system that it operates outside of the framework of the United Nations Charter, the rule of law, that became known as the rules-based international order. And one of the key elements of it was the way the United States would provide aid to other nations to help with reconstruction. It was done in a way that would promote the dominance of the dollar. The dollar would become the currency of exchange. We had the Marshall Plan for Europe, and then we extended the Marshall Plan to Eastern Bloc countries that were then occupied by the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the war. And several of these countries wanted to engage, but the Soviets said, no, we're not thrilled about the idea of the dollar coming in and becoming the dominant currency. And so the Soviets balked at being involved in this. And there was a guy named George Kennan, a famous American diplomat. And a lot of people, he wrote something called The Long Telegram. And people recognize that in history as the document that started the conversation that led to a policy of containing the Soviet Union, because he painted a very stark and dark portrait of the Soviets as being in opposition to the West, America. But if you go back to what prompted his long telegram, it wasn't Stalin trying to flex his muscles to take over Eastern Europe or the Soviets threatening to go to war. It was the Soviets simply saying, we don't want the dollar coming into our country. That's it. We reject this. If there's a way to bring aid, we'll do it, but we're not going to allow you to come in and dictate how our economy works. And so Kennan overreacted. He basically used that rejection to say the Soviets will never cooperate with the West, will never be on our side, and that we are looking for perpetual conflict. Now, he didn't mean war. He meant ideological conflict, economic conflict. But the national security people in Washington, D.C. said, no, he means war. We have to prepare for that. So this became what's called NSC 68, which are National Security Document, NSD 68, which was a document under the Truman administration that defined a new policy of containment, containing the Soviet Union. But now, how do we contain the Soviet Union? We have to do it in mechanisms outside of the framework of the United Nations, because the Soviet Union is a permanent member of the United Nations. So you can't use the United Nations to contain the Soviet Union. You need to construct a new framework through the World Bank, through International Monetary Fund, through NATO. We had other alliances, CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, which had Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, Iraq together. CETO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. We created treaty organizations that surrounded the Soviet Union, and then we bolstered them with aid, economic dominance, et cetera, to impose a order that isn't law-based. It doesn't come from the charter. It's rules-based, dictated by the United States. There's no international agreement that says this is to be. It was the United States saying, this is how it's going to be. We are the supreme power. We will dictate the solution to our unilateral advantage. That is the rules-based international order. But today, the rules-based international order worked. Let's use an analogy, and I'm going to irritate every country in the world, and I apologize. But at the end of the Second World War, basically the United States was the adult, and the rest of the world were children. They were children. They had destroyed economies. They couldn't function. They needed the adult to guide them. And this is the God's honest truth. I'm not being insulting. Even Great Britain and France needed America to guide them, to help them. But at some point in time, children grow up. And when the children grow up, as all children, they no longer, now that they are adults, they do not want to be governed by the rules set forth by their parents. They want to function as equals. And this is where we are today. The world has grown up, and the world sort of gets angry when the United States tries to dictate solutions. Now, we have some people, let's call them the spoiled, rotten children, who loved being under their parents' wing, and they live in the basement. You know those kind, the 30-year-olds who live in the basement still, and that's what Europe is. Europe is a continent of basement dwellers, people who never grew up, who've always lived under the umbrella of the United States. Japan is a basement dweller. South Korea is a basement dweller. Australia is a basement dweller. These are children that just didn't grow up. They're so comfortable to be under mommy's wing, daddy's wing, and they just want to stay that way forever. But then there are the others, the sturdy kids who said, thank you for your help, but we're now adults. India, China, Russia, Africa, the African continent is full of adults. Asia is full of adults. People who said, we don't want to be treated like children anymore. We want a seat at the table. And when we sit at the table, we don't want Papa America coming at the head of the table telling us when we can eat, what we can eat, how we can eat. We want to make a determination. We want to look at the menu and select for ourselves what we want from the menu, what's best for us. America's welcome to sit at the table. In fact, America must sit at the table because America is a player, but they sit at the table. not the head of the table. And that's where Russia is today. They're saying, look, we will work with America. We're not rejecting America, but America isn't our boss. America doesn't get to dictate to us. America must sit with us and work with us as equals in a multipolar world. In order to do that, and here's the key part, Russia and China met in February of last year in Beijing, February 4th, and Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping released a 5,000 plus word joint statement that rejected the rules-based international order, said it's dead. And they said, instead, we're going to replace it with a law-based international order, and the law being the United Nations Charter. Russia and China are getting back to first principles, back to the basics, back to what the world was supposed to look like at the end of the Second World War, where the charter defined notions of equality for all, as opposed to what America did, which is to try and impose a rules-based order where America is the singular power around which everything rotates. I hope I provided an explanation.
Excellent explanation. Thank you, Scott. When I read your book, and let's mention the book, it's Disarmament at the Time of Perestroyka. Not many people know what perestroika is. Oh, thanks for showing it. I read it on Kindle version. I have the other book, hard copy, but that one on Kindle, so I can't show it. But it was an excellent book. I recommend everyone to read it. It's just perfect. I mean, historical references, personal experiences, Scott details in that book. It's amazing, wonderful book, and it's a great read. I recommend it highly. In your book, Scott, you talked about disarmament and how important it is. I remember there was something about cargo scan that you guys tried to do to scan these missiles to find out, like, what is it inside? I mean, there's so much technical information. I don't pretend to understand all of the technical parts, but it seems
neither do I.
It seems so laborious and intense that I was like, in all the numbers, you have to just like, wow, Scott knows all these numbers. And that book's just amazing. But what I did, I looked up the nuclear, like who has the most nuclear weapons, because I'm sure we're all concerned about nuclear, thermonuclear war, however people want to call this. I am afraid that, like you said, adults in the room, who are the adults in the room anymore? I see the war between Russia, Ukraine, NATO, everybody's trying to get in, Poland tries to get in. Zelensky screams, let's do a preemptive strike on Russia. Medvedev, a Russian former president, comes out yesterday and says, oh, those people in Davos are, talking about that peace only can be achieved if Russia loses on the battlefield. He says, I have news for them. No nation with nuclear weapons have ever lost a major conflict like that. So when I hear all this talk about nuclear, thermonuclear, and then I read your book and how you advocate for disarmament, I looked up to see who has the nuclear, heads or weapons and who had them before. I came across the article and it showed that the peak of everybody having the most, I almost think it was 70,000 warheads. I mean, there was something upwards of dozens and dozens of these warheads. I think it was around 70s, 80s or something. And then it's a sharp drop. And now United States and at this time Russia, they tread sort of evenly on the amount. Russia has a little bit more, but it's not like at the time when I looked back at the chart, the Soviet Union had more than everyone as far as nuclear weapons. And now United States and Russia are pretty much plus minus, I'm thinking few hundred warheads. But Scott, looking at the chart, I looked at the time frame and I said, maybe, again, I'm a business person. I don't claim to be a politician or know anything about, the inner workings of how people do this. I am looking at it as a rational person. Doesn't it seem like when Soviet Union had the most warheads, then there was less wars based on that chart? Because I'm looking at Obama's time when weapons dropped already and they're quite low. Then I see that this is the period when Libya war started and Iraq war started and Syria war started and all these wars. And I'm thinking, I'm going to ask Scott. Scott, what do you think? I mean, did disarmament help to curb the situation in the world to be more peaceful? Or, I mean, I don't know. I mean, is it really a deterrent to have nuclear weapons? Of course, they're horrible, and we don't ever want anybody to use them. And Russia doesn't want to use them, and I hope the United States doesn't want to use them. But we always thought that this is sort of a deterrent. But the more we go this year and the last year with Russia, Ukraine, the more I see that there is a very real possibility of nuclear exchange. And that scares us all. But what do you think? Because the peak of everybody having nuclear weapons almost kind of, to me, as a rational human being, seems like it had less wars. And when they drop, now that we have all these wars, I mean, does it have anything to do with it? Or this is just our policy? Or, and if Russia, pardon, just finish, and if Russia says that we don't trust United States, if we have a disarmament, and you, let's say, work on the disarmament with Russia, which I know that those negotiations stalled again, START treaty, or what is it, New START treaty, something along these lines. And I think you mentioned it, that Russians even said that American side now tries to redefine the words inside that treaty. In other words, if Russia cannot trust United States in disarmament, and according to you, disarmament is the way to go, how does this all fit? And does disarmament help to create more peace in the world? Or does these terrible weapons, do they provide a deterrent? I hope it's not too much info in one question. What do you think, Scott?
No, good question. Good question. Let me just start off by making the following points. The United States became a nuclear power in 1945. I think Russia followed a few years later. In 1950, we had the Korean War. Nuclear weapons didn't stop the Korean War. In 1956, we had the Suez Crisis. Nuclear weapons didn't stop the Suez Crisis. In the 60s, we had the Vietnam War. Nuclear weapons didn't stop that. Russia had a war in Afghanistan in the 70s and the 80s. Nuclear weapons didn't stop that. And there were countless wars beyond that. There was the Iran-Iraq War. Israel fought several wars with its Arab neighbors. China fought a border war with Vietnam. And we just go on and on and on. So unfortunately, nuclear weapons don't prevent war. What kept us from destroying each other with nuclear weapons at that time wasn't so much that we had so many of them. It's that we recognized that if there was a nuclear war, we would both die. It's called mutually assured destruction. When we first started building nuclear weapons, we were looking for advantages to basically say we are the spirit. We were planning for active war. Had we gone to war against the Soviet Union in the 60s, the first thing we'd have done is nuke Russian cities, automatic, just nuke them, and they would try to nuke some of us. And we had these game theorists who came up with how we would win a nuclear war. And we would win the nuclear war by destroying the Soviet Union's ability to continue to exist as a modern nation state while preserving enough population and industrial capacity so that the United States could reconstitute itself, knowing that we would lose 100 million people. Now, when John F. Kennedy, back when he became president, when he was taken down to the Pentagon to be briefed on what we back then we called the SIOP, Singular Inter-Operational Plan, or I don't know what it was, but the PSYOP is what it was called, which is our nuclear war plan. And he came down, and remember, he's the commander in chief. He gets to make the call. He comes down to the Pentagon, and they present him a plan. And he says, wait a minute. So if we go to war, we're going to kill everybody. And they said, yes, sir. He said, but I want options. They said, there are no other options. He said, I want options. And so they built options. They came back and gave him a plan that said, and he said, but wait a minute. If I do this plan, it automatically goes to this plan. So there is no option. You've just made it cuter. And he walked out and he turned to an aide and he said, and we call ourselves the human race, meaning what has gone wrong with us? And every president that's been briefed on the American nuclear war plan since then has come away with the same reaction. This is literally insanity. And fortunately, in the 1960s, we're in the business now of building newer weapons, and the Russians are catching up. They're building newer weapons. So we're building, missiles that can reach out and destroy a Russian silo. So the Russians harden their silo and build missiles with multiple warheads to come and attack us. So then we build missiles with multiple warheads and we put them on submarines. And then the Russians do this, and then we do this. And with it. Next thing you know, we're both going, holy cow, we're about to kill each other. And so we started building missile defense systems. And we're testing them, and we realize they don't work. And they're very expensive. So rather than continue this arms race, we sat down with the Soviets and said, why don't we get rid of ballistic missile defense? Why don't we make it so that we understand that if there's a war, there is no defense? If there's a nuclear war, we were all going to die. And we both embraced this concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD. And lo and behold, we stopped trying to kill each other. And next thing you know, from the ABM Treaty, which I believe was signed in 1972, comes what we call the Strategic Arm Limitation Treaty. Not reducing weapons, but slowing how we expand them to eliminate certain types of missiles that were called destabilizing. And then we had SALT 1, then we had SALT 2. But then disarmament ran into a hiccup. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and Jimmy Carter prevented the final ratification of SALT II, and arms control sort of went to a hiatus. And then after Jimmy Carter came a guy named Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was like, I don't believe in any of this arms control stuff, ironically. He's the guy that said, we're going to do something called Strategic Defense Initiative, which was literally a violation of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, but he didn't care. And he also started to build new categories of nuclear weapons that would give us first strike capability. That is, that we can reach out and hit the Soviets, eliminate their capability so they can't retaliate. And we were planning on, once again, winning a nuclear war. Frightening stuff. Then in the late 1970s, the Soviets deployed a missile, and I write about it in my book, the SS-20, the Pioneer. And it's a road mobile missile, solid rocket fuel, which means it doesn't take long to get ready to fire. The vehicle stops, raises, fires, and off goes a missile with 3 nuclear warheads that can take out 3 European cities. And the Soviets built hundreds of these missiles. And the Europeans are going, whoa, 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 time out. This is awful. What are we going to do about it? And America said, well, we'll deploy our own intermediate nuclear forces onto European soil. And the Europeans are going, wait a minute. So we got a problem between America and the Soviet Union, and we're going to pay the price. If there's a war, we're going to die. And they didn't like it. There were massive demonstrations in Europe against this, but NATO made the decision that the only way to confront the SS-20 was to deploy these systems. One of the systems deployed was called the Pershing II. We had a Pershing 1 missile. The Pershing II, again, is a solid rocket missile with a warhead. But the thing about it is, if it got fired from a base in West Germany, it could hit Moscow in 7 minutes. And that means that there's no time to think. So if the missile gets fired and is heading towards Moscow, the Russians don't have a time to say, oh, was this a false alarm? Was this a mistake? They have to assume that this was indeed the attack, and they have to fire everything. And the Russians had something called the dead hand. The dead hand system that, let's say the Pershing II got through and killed everybody in the Kremlin. Doesn't matter. The dead hand takes over. And the dead hand has sensors, acoustic sensors, radiation sensors. And if communications is no longer coming out of Moscow, the dead hand automatically goes, launch everything. And they fire these missiles that have communications capsules, and it flies over the Soviet Union, broadcasting the launch codes, and all the missiles get fired to the United States, and the world ends. So now you say, oh gosh, well, okay, but still, it's not that bad, right? No. In 1983, NATO held an exercise called Able Archer 83, 83 being the year. Able Archer was the final exercise in a sequence of exercises called Reforger, Return of Forces to Germany. We had 300,000 troops stationed in Germany at the time, but to fight the Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces, we needed 500,000. But we didn't want to station 500,000 there. So we would fly in 200,000, 250,000 troops, and we trained to do this every year. And so in 1983, we flew in tens of thousands of American forces who married up with their tanks and everything, and they were positioned. And the Soviets are looking at this going, They just built up their forces. They're pointed at us. And now Able Archer 83 comes in, which is a nuclear command post exercise that for the first time is going to practice what is needed to launch nuclear weapons against the Soviets. And the Soviets are going, they are getting ready to do a preemptive first strike. They're going to hit us with nuclear weapons. So the Soviets put all those SS-20s on high alert. Now they're out there ready to launch. They put their airplanes on the runway with nuclear bombs attached, pilot in the cockpit, engine running, so that the second there was a hint of an accident, they take off and they start. We were that close to nuclear war, that close. Later on, when Ronald Reagan was briefed on it, someone said, yeah, well, we dodged a bullet there. The Soviets actually thought we were going to attack. He said, they didn't really think that, did they? And they said, yes, sir, they did. And he said, that's insane. And that moment combined with, there was an assassination attempt against Reagan. And while he was in the hospital bed of recovery, he watched a program put on by ABC News called The Day After about nuclear war. And he said, is this real? And one of his advisors said, no, sir, that's nothing. Reality would be far worse. Oh, and he said, that's insane. Yeah. So suddenly this guy, Ronald Reagan, who was a Cold Warrior, who, wanted to learn to fight a winnable nuclear war, woke up to the insanity of it all. Yeah. And they began the process of working with the Soviets through disarmament to get rid of these weapons that had put us on the brink of nuclear conflict. So one of your questions is the world safer because of disarmament? Let me put it this way, as stark as I can. Had there not been an INF treaty, we would all be dead because there would have been a nuclear war. An accident would have occurred. These weapons would have been used, and it'd be all over. You and I wouldn't be having this conversation. So disarmament made us safer. I know there's a lot of people in the former Soviet Union and Russia who take an opposite point of view. They feel that nuclear weapons is the only thing that gives them relevance. No, there's so much more that gives Russia relevance than nuclear weapons. But unfortunately, because of the attitude the United States has taken in the post-Cold War, post-Soviet environment, we no longer treat the Russians with respect. We signed an INF treaty that was mutual. Both parties respected, it was reciprocal, etc. But once the Soviet Union collapsed, there were many people who believed we don't need to treat the Russians like we treated the Soviets, that we should, instead of negotiating treaties that reduce both, we should negotiate treaties that increase our strength, our power, our prestige. And the Russians weren't in any position to argue with them. Boris Yeltsin had his arm twisted to sign up to treaties that were inadequate, to use a Russian turn of the phrase. And now we're in a situation where we desperately need arms control. Donald Trump, George W. Bush pulled out of the ABM treaty, anti-ballistic missile treaty. So now the United States is deploying anti-ballistic missile systems on the periphery of Russia, and Russia has every right to be concerned about this. And now we're getting ready. We got out of the INF treaty, and we're getting ready to deploy a new category of missile, which, like Pershing II, if fired, can strike Moscow in 5 minutes. Well, you know what the Russians have retained? The dead hand. Nobody's talking about it. It's there. So we're literally reliving history as we speak. And here's the frustrating part. Earlier we talked about National Security Document 68, the containment strategy. The guy who wrote that was named Paul Nietzsche. And he was a Cold Warrior. He did not like the Soviet Union, didn't trust him at all, etc. But, that was written in the early 1950s. In the early 1980s, 30 years later, guess who is our INF treaty negotiator? Ooh. Paul Nietzsche. Paul Nietzsche. And what I'm trying to say is, here's a man with 30 years experience under his belt. He has seen it all. He has lived through everything. He's lived through every aspect of the Cold War, the ABM treaty, the SALT treaties, etc. So when he's sitting down with his Soviet counterparts now, they're very experienced people who know how to negotiate. They understand what's at stake. They understand the consequences. And because of that, we got the INF treaty. Only because of this experience, because of these veterans, these experienced arms controllers. Then when we walked away from serious arms control, Paul Nietzsche retires. All the people who negotiated these treaties are retired. And because we're not using the disarmament muscles, they atrophy. And today we have no disarmament staff. worthy of the name. Yes, we have people in the position, but they don't know arms control. They don't know treaties. They don't know how to negotiate a treaty. They don't know how to treat the Russians with respect. Unfortunately, the State Department, which used to take the lead in this, has been bullied out of the way by the Defense Department. And the Defense Department's in the business of buying weapons, building new units, using the weapons. You can't make them in charge of
Disarmament, yes.
And yet, and in Russia, it's the same thing. And remember, disarmament is a two-way street. You can have the best disarmament staff in the world, but if the other side isn't coming to the table, you're not using them. And because most disarmament professionals are very skilled diplomats, they then get sent off to do other work. And on the Russian side, the same thing. Their strong disarmament muscle has atrophied. One of their most experienced current arms control specialists is Anatoly Antonov, the man who negotiated the New START Treaty. Today, he's the Russian ambassador to the United States. But he says, he's given interviews where he says, I'm literally a bird in a gilded cage. Here I am, an expert on disarmament, expert on America, in America at a time when we desperately need disarmament, and nobody will talk to me. Nobody will talk to me. I'm by myself here. It's an absolute waste of resources. And he said the same thing, that in Russia, the defense ministry has taken over the disarmament portfolio. And again, it's the same mistake. So now we have a situation where the American Defense Department and the Russian Defense Ministry are responsible for disarmament, and they don't want to disarm. They're taking the exact opposite approach. We need a strong, robust nuclear capability. And now the United States is talking about redeploying INF system. This is where history becomes important, because we've done this before, and it almost led to the end of the world. We're making the same mistakes as we did in the past, only this time we don't have Paul Nietzsche. We don't have experienced people. We have amateurs. We have generals who don't want to disarm in charge of putting these weapons in place. And we're back to that situation that we were in 1983 after Able Archer, where we were this close to a nuclear war. But this time we don't have the means to rapidly reduce the tension through the enactment and negotiation of a meaningful treaty. We live in very, very dangerous times.